Maayang adlaw, welcome to Season 3 of Filipinx in Wellness. I'm your host, Cheryl Samson Ramirez. In our last episode, we launched Season 3 with Nes Marco Morales, Kuya Galo, talking about dentistry and capoeira. From the perspective of a dental hygienist, we looked into preventative oral care. This month, we are honoring Mental Health Awareness Month with an East Coast twist. Our guest is Pauline Montemayor, licensed psychotherapist and the owner and practitioner of H.O.P.E Psychotherapy Services, LLC. Before we begin, we'd like to mention that we uphold and honor this safe space to share. We ask everyone to pose comments and questions on our platform in a peaceful and respectful manner. Our pre-recorded episodes are accessible through our Filipinx in Wellness YouTube channel. The audio recordings are available via Apple Podcasts and Spotify. All views discussed are for informational and educational purposes only. It is not meant to be medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare practitioner for your particular condition, especially before starting any exercise or new health program. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Pauline Montemayor. Welcome to the podcast, Pauline.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's nice to also have you here. Hi.
Hi.
And we really also love the opportunity to expand our reach and gather different perspectives on this podcast. That's why we're calling this the East Coast edition, and we're so thankful to have you on as our guest.
Yes, thank you again for having me. I'm happy to represent for the Filipinx community on the East Coast.
Sweet. We'd like to open our episodes with one of the first questions you're asked when someone finds out you're a Filipinx or Filipino. Where is your family from in the Philippines? And where are you currently streaming from, in case that's different from where you're residing?
So my dad is from Pangasinan in Luzon, and my mom is from Davao in Mindanao. And thanks to my maternal grandmother, I also have some lineage in the Bogobo tribe, because she was actually considered a princess in the Bogobo tribe during her time. So I'm definitely proud of my indigenous roots and heritage as well. A lot of people always ask how my parents met, since they're from opposite ends of the Philippines. But they actually met here in the States and then got married in the Philippines and came back and settled here. So I was born here. I'm first generation. And I'm streaming from a kind of small but really cool suburban town called Montclair in New Jersey.
Sweet. There's also Montclair in California. So it's good to know there's also Montclair over there in New Jersey.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And what a treat. We've never had anyone from the lineage or descendant of the Bogobo tribe. It's amazing that you are a descendant from that actual indigenous group located in Mindanao. Is there anything else that you'd like to share that you know about that side of the family?
To be honest, I'm still in the process of learning. It's something that I'm just learning to now more embrace and understand. And I'm actually traveling back home to the Philippines this summer. So I'm really hoping to connect more there and hopefully gain a lot more knowledge and understanding of the Bogobo tribe and their traditions and ways. Nice. So hopefully more to come.
We can't wait to hear a report back when you come back.
Definitely.
Let's dive in, Pauline. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and so we decided to devote this episode to mental health in our community. When we initially launched on Clubhouse, Rihanna and I interviewed some mental health providers, Erica Tumbaga and Andrea Jacks. I believe she's also from the East Coast. I don't know if you know Andrea, but they're both licensed clinical social workers, and Jason Bueno, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist, all based in Southern California. Pauline, you have your own private practice, H.O.P.E Psychotherapy Services, LLC, based out of New Jersey. H.O.P.E is an acronym from when I saw the spelling. Tell us what it stands for.
Sure. So it actually stands for healing oneself through positivity and encouragement. I really wanted to base my practice on the foundation of healing. And I do believe that people have the ability to heal themselves. It's just a matter of learning the right skills and tools to be able to do so.
Nice. And what a great acronym, first of all. That's such a cool way to break it down, and really the therapeutic process. Tell us also what made you decide to pursue a career in social work in private practice, Pauline?
Sure. So after undergrad, I was working in the nonprofit industry for about 4 years. And then honestly, it was a calling. I really felt called to help people. I really wanted to help people. I especially wanted to help those who were more marginalized populations. And my passion was really wanting to work with the inner city urban youth demographic. So I left my job and I pursued my master's degree in social work. And then from there, I lived out my dream of being able to work with the inner city urban youth. So I worked with children and adolescents and families for the majority of my career, mostly in inner city settings. I worked a lot in the hospital and community mental health agency settings. And then about 5 years ago, I started my private practice. I started just doing it part-time. I was still working in the hospital full-time, did my practice on the side. And thankfully, over the years, my clientele built up. And last year, I took the big dive and I went full-time with my private practice. So now I'm doing that completely full-time. But I kind of switched gears. So now I'm working mainly with adults. And I still see some high school age adolescents. But I took a break from the kids for now. So this kind of allowed me to have more autonomy in my work and be able to do more deep, meaningful work with adults and older age adolescents.
Nice. And so are you still working with the same inner city, urban demographic in your private practice?
It's actually a mix now. So I still have some clientele from that demographic or those who actually grew up in that environment. And then I also have those who are from more of the suburban or middle class areas as well. So there's a blend now.
You mentioned earlier that you were in Montclair. What's the closest big city to you?
Newark is a couple minutes away. Not a couple minutes, maybe 15 minutes away. So that's probably the biggest city that's close to where we are.
I know Newark is a lot of, that's also a good place to fly in when you're going to New York. So I'm imagining You're in the northern part of Jersey?
Yes, that is correct.
Cool. And let's talk more about Jersey for our listeners that don't know too much about Jersey or haven't visited it. And obviously, we know it's way more than Jersey Shore is what we see on TV.
Yes,
and
that is for sure.
I mean, New Jersey has its pockets of Filipinx communities, contrary to popular belief, or maybe people that don't know. What areas in New Jersey have the most Filipinx or Filipino populations? Let's start there.
So there actually, like you said, are a good amount of Filipinos here in Jersey. I would say a majority are in the northern or central regions of the state. Most of us live in areas that are pretty close to New York City. We're all within 30, 45 minutes commute to New York, whether by car, train, or bus. So we're kind of near the metropolitan area. There are some Filipinos who live in South Jersey, but not as many. So the bulk, I would say, are more in the northern and central region of the state.
All right. So most of the Filipinos that do they commute into the city to work, or some of them stay in Jersey?
It's a blend of both. Some do work in New York and some stay here in Jersey. So there's, it's easy access to both. I think it just depends on where they land jobs or where they want to work.
And then in regards to your clientele, what kinds of industries are they in? Is it similar to what we see here on the West Coast? Healthcare, maybe accounting, engineering? Yeah. If you could tell us more about that demographic.
Yeah, sure. With my Filipinx clientele, it actually ranges with their industries as well. There are some who are in healthcare, some who are in education, in engineering, entertainment industry, fashion industry, service industry. So they're all pretty much young professionals, but the industries definitely vary.
Okay. And do you find that your clientele that are Filipino, because I'm assuming you also have non-Filipino clientele?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so the ones that are Filipino, what's their demographic in terms of, let's start with male to female ratio.
A majority are female. So yeah, a couple males, but not as many. Definitely more female.
Yeah. Male identified, I should correct myself. Male
Yeah,
or
sorry,
female
yeah, it is.
identified.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, correct.
And then also in regards to age group, what does that consist of?
Mostly in their 20s and 30s.
Okay. And do
Yes.
you also see adolescents that are Filipino or?
Currently, I don't. The adolescents that I do see are non-Filipino.
Okay. Let's talk about what are the reasons why your Filipino clients or your Filipinx clients, why do they seek therapy or private practice with you?
For most of them, it's usually dealing with anxiety or depression, or they have like some trauma history. Also, just some issues around cultural identity as well.
And so would you say that these are the top 3 mental health challenges that your clientele is mainly facing?
Yes.
All
Yes.
right. Tell us more about that. Let's kind of really look at that in a deeper like way and talk about all of them. So you mentioned anxiety. Let's start there. What are some of the reasons or factors that play into anxiety amongst your clientele within our community?
Sure. So what I've seen and observed is a lot of times with the anxiety, there's a lot of pressure, I think, to be very like performative in everything that they're doing. Meaning, like, I feel like a lot of them attach their self-worth based on their accomplishments, what they achieved in school, professionally, and life milestones. So I think a lot of time there's anxiety about like, did I do enough? Am I doing enough? And also like, is my family okay with my choices? Are my parents approving of the things that I'm doing or the things that I'm choosing for myself? And with that, I think there's also been a lot of anxiety just because of, people having feelings of uncertainty or having feelings of self-doubt and not being sure if they're making the right choices or if they're doing enough or doing what would be pleasing or acceptable to their parents or to other family members. And what I've seen is a lot of like people-pleasing behaviors, which I think also correlates with the anxiety, but I think that also ties into the depressive piece as well.
Okay. Just maybe looking into the anxiety piece more. Where do you think that people-pleasing behavior comes from what you're seeing?
I think a lot of it comes from the upbringing. I think with most of my Filipinx clientele are either first generation or they immigrated here when they were young children. So most have grown up in very traditional, like old school, Filipino households with parents who still carry very old school traditional values. And with that, I think is a lot of the mentality of like, the parent is always right. You have to comply, obey, and do what your parents are asking you or telling you to do. So I think with that, there's a lot of people-pleasing tendencies and behaviors that form, and people having fears about diverting away from that or disappointing or upsetting family members or loved ones, not just even in family. I've seen it with, having fears of not pleasing people in the workplace or in their friendships or in their relationships. So I think just that whole like dynamics of there being more of an authoritative parental role and that mentality of like almost I guess entitlement of, the parent's always correct and you got to do what I say has kind of bred, I think, a lot of people pleasing behaviors and tendencies in others.
I see. And it sounds like when you really are striving for that people-pleasing behavior, that also connects to a form of depression, especially if you can't always meet those types of demands that either their parents are putting on them or sometimes they're putting on themselves. Do you find that it's more, is it both? Is it that our community is just feeling the demand from our parents and then ultimately it's manifesting onto this pressure that we put on ourselves?
Yes, I do see that. I feel like it is this pressure of not only pleasing their parents, but also pleasing their coworkers or their friends, their partners, their colleagues, and even like strangers or people they don't even really care so much for. There's always like this worry of like, not even worry, but also a guilt I've seen, people feeling ashamed or feeling guilty when they feel that they've let someone down, or when they've disappointed someone or said no to something. And I think, where it kind of ties into the depression part is that, when you're people pleasing, you're not living for yourself anymore. You're living for other people. You're living to meet other people's needs and putting your needs on the back burner. And ultimately that leads to a lot of unhappiness, because now you're not able to fulfill what you want for yourself.
Let's unpack the depression a bit more now that we're segueing into that. What does depression look like amongst your Filipinx clientele?
I think for a lot of them, it is the unhappiness, sadness. For a lot of them are, having crying spells. Sometimes I'm feeling unmotivated or feeling very lost or confused about their life path or their choices and decisions, and about their futures, if what they're doing is the right thing, or if they'll be successful in their future. Okay.
You also mentioned generational trauma, Pauline. How does that look like with your Filipinx clientele? I know in the past episode, we've talked about generational trauma and intergenerational trauma with our mental health providers on Clubhouse, and unfortunately we weren't able to record that episode. But now we have an opportunity to really dive in and talk about intergenerational trauma within our community and how it manifests within mental health. So bring us, to that place of what is intergenerational trauma and generational trauma, as you coined it too. What does that look like in regards to our community and within your clientele?
So I think a lot of what I've seen is patterns, repeating from things that, parents or even grandparents experienced, and now it's repeating in this current generation. So this includes things such as like abuse, like emotional or even physical abuse. Another common one is around finances, because, there are sometimes families that grew up in a lot of poverty in the Philippines, and then coming here to the States, there's so much worry and stress around money and finances that sometimes the children then adapt that same worry, that same burden about money and being financially successful and stable. Also things like emotional unavailability are things I've seen too, or passive aggressive communication, like just sometimes the lack of emotional support, or the poor communication skills are repeating in cycles in these generations. And I think in this current generation now, what's happening is they've adopted a lot of these things, and it's now manifesting in several different aspects of their life, not only in the family and in the home, but even in their own personal relationships, or personal endeavors as well.
Yeah, a lot of the things, unfortunately, that we've inherited from colonialism, or inheriting also this colonial mentality, has permeated through so many factors or relationships. You mentioned environments that we deal with in our daily lives. You talked about physical and emotional abuse, and we know when we look at history, we see the origins of that. It's similar to what we see in other BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities that have had a colonial history, right? In regards to maybe what the conquistador or the missionaries had inflicted upon like the indigenous people within the Philippines, that unfortunately has been passed down from generation to generation. The financial piece is really interesting. So when you're looking at stress around finances, is it that people feel like they're not making enough, or maybe when they are making that money, they don't know how to financially invest it or spend it appropriately?
I think it's, like the worry, even when they are actually financially successful and they have, very successful careers, there's still this lingering fear of they're going to run out of money, or they're not going to have enough to sustain or to be able to do the things they want to do. like there's always still some kind of worry in their mind about either money running out, or there not being enough, or they'll just lose the money one day. I haven't seen so much of like misspending or like misallocating, but I think it's just been more and more of the worry of there, I guess, not being enough money, even though they are actually making good incomes.
Right. That it's kind of like that mentality that lack rather
Yes.
than, right? That feeling that like not the opposite of abundance, but really feeling deprived. Yeah. And you also talked about emotional unavailability, right? Now, what does that look like? Give us a little bit more of detail in regards to that and what you're seeing.
Sure. So some things I've seen are, you know, a lot of people's experience with their parents has been that the parents were maybe physically there and definitely financially provided in terms of, you know, education, monetary things, material things. But when it comes to the emotional piece, their parents were not really present. A lot of what I've seen is, you know, some of my Filipinx clientele is, you know, for those that have mental health issues and have actual diagnoses, a lot of times those were dismissed or minimized by family members, or they didn't understand that they were actually having these significant mental health challenges. I also think part of it too is there not being space for people to be able to express themselves emotionally or be able to feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable with their parents or their family members and talk about their challenges and their hardships. Because then there's the whole notion of either one, they don't want to be a burden to their parents, or they don't want to disappoint them, you know, or let them down. And then that feeling of indebtedness also, like, oh, they did so much for me, I can't be complaining about these problems I'm having because this is not as big as to what they may have experienced.
Yeah, that utang ng loob value that we talk about a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you see as the core of it all? When you think about the core of all of the things that you're manifesting, where would you even begin to start?
In terms of like
all these mental health challenges that you're seeing amongst our clientele and within our community. What do you think? What do you see as the origin and the core? Like, are they within, wrapped up in our value system? Like, are there? Do you see them attached to certain events?
I think it's a mix of different things. I think some of it is in our value system. I think it's also in our family structures. I also think a lot of it has to do with our communication patterns and habits. You know, there not being a lot of space being held for other people to express themselves, or a lot of passive aggressive communication, which I think sometimes some Filipino elders are like notorious for sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it boils down to a lot of like feelings of personal or like self rejection, or feeling inadequate. And I think that's a very deep wound. I think that ties all the way back to colonization, you know, and the rejection that, you know, our people faced, you know, by the Spaniards and the Americans and all of that. But I think we are still carrying some of that wound within us. But I notice there's a lot of lack of self-validation that goes on, you know, and people feeling like what they're experiencing is not right, or is not good enough, or is wrong. And I always say, like, whatever you feel is valid. You know, no one else has to validate that. But I think the lack of validation that often happens at home or in the family dynamic then carries over into the personal experience. And I think a lot of the root is there too.
You mentioned that you have predominantly female-identified clientele and some male-identified clientele. Are there distinctions between the challenges that you're seeing between the two gender identifications and roles?
Not really, actually.
Interesting.
It's the issues are actually the same across both sides, which is interesting as well. I think if anything on the male side, or the male identified side, it's just more about like, the responsibility of being like the man or being like the kuya in the home. But I think in terms of the other issues that we were discussing, it's the same. It's actually the same from what I've seen.
And hearing all of this too, I actually want to circle back to your own personal story in pursuing this mental health career, Pauline. What was it like within your own family when you told your parents you were going to pursue a career in mental health? Normally, that's not something that like a lot of our parents want us to choose when we go on a career path. So,
Yeah.
just let's bring in your personal story into this.
Sure. My parents were actually supportive of it. I think they were kind of worried about like if I make enough, money.
I did too. What your clients deal with, right?
Yeah. I know they had a lot of concerns and worries about me working in the inner city areas, just because of like the danger and the risks. I think that was challenging for them to understand that I actually wanted to be in these areas. Most people don't want to work in those areas or work with that population of people. They prefer to be in like safer, more affluent neighborhoods. And I actually wanted to be there. I wanted to work with that demographic of people. So I think they had a hard time understanding that. Because I think it was kind of like, why would you want to go there when we've afforded you this life and you can, work in safer neighborhoods and work with people, who are not in those, more challenging life situations. But I think that was kind of where the challenge was them understanding, my calling to that population of people.
And you probably got close when you were working in the hospital setting there, like, oh, it was something that they could recognize and say, oh, now you're working in the hospital setting with all the other Filipino nurses.
Yeah. It's healthcare, so it's safe, I guess, in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about the stigma piece, because mental health or seeking talk therapy, it's a stigma within our community. So what is your take on the stigma? Let's talk about that and unpack that.
Sure. It's annoying.
Yeah.
I think it's so annoying and it's so outdated. I think, looking at the generational gap, I think a lot of older, Filipinos have the mentality that, there must be something really, really wrong with someone if they have to go to therapy. And I completely disagree. I always say there doesn't have to be anything wrong for someone to go to therapy. In fact, it's probably better if you go before something, before a crisis or something happens. But also what I've seen, I think, in this younger generation of Filipino clients is, to be honest, some of them don't tell their parents that they're in therapy. Or haven't told family members because of the stigma and because of the worry that they're going to be judged. Right. They're going to be judged. They're going to be, questioned or shamed for seeing me, or for going to therapy. And I think some of them also struggled with, feeling like, are my problems big enough for me to come in? Because I think sometimes in, expressing some of their stressors with parents or older relatives, in their families, a lot of times the problems are really minimized. Like, oh, that's not so bad. When I was your age, I had to do this, this, and this. And then there's this comparison going on that is really not fair because the experiences are going to be completely different. It's a different generation, different time, different culture.
Yeah.
So I think, there's that piece of it too.
I know when we were preparing for this show, Pauline, we were also talking about clientele. You mentioned industries earlier that your clientele works within. Like, so you mentioned entertainment, fashion, engineering. They work in education. We were also talking about identity within the context of these industries and how maybe some of them work in industries where they're the only like Filipino or Filipinx person within that industry, and how they have to break through this type of identification or being able to claim themselves within these spaces. Let's talk about that. I know we didn't mention that in our mental health challenges, but I'd love to talk about that further for our listeners and our viewers to just kind of marinate on that.
Sure. So kind of just to backtrack, I think a lot of the Filipinx clientele I work with have had experiences even in childhood where they were the only Filipino, the only Asian, sometimes the only person of color in their neighborhood or in their school. So sometimes, they had experiences of bullying, or being ostracized or being shamed, for who they are. And the thing with Jersey is, like, as many Filipinos as we have here, and even if you live in a town where there's like a good amount of Filipinos, you're still the minority. You're still going to be the minority amongst everybody else. So, some of them have had experiences of feeling ashamed to be Filipino and having to try to hide our culture or trying to assimilate with those who were around them. And then from there, what's happened is now some of them have gone into these industries and workspaces where they are the only person of color or the only Asian or the only Filipinx person. And there's now this challenge of navigating, this experience of being the only one. And I think a lot of it is what I've seen is like them, often being very passive and having a lot of challenges being able to take up space and be assertive and advocate for themselves, even when there is times they've been mistreated, or have had things done in the work setting that were not really necessarily fair or correct. They would be afraid to speak up or afraid to say something. So I think that passivity kind of translated from childhood now into adulthood in the professional settings. And I think that there's been, a lot of challenges for them just figuring out how to be themselves and be comfortable and be confident in the workplace. And, and I think in adulthood too, them trying now to tune in more to their Filipino identity and embracing our culture. There's this struggle now of like, man, all these years I was trying to not be Filipino or was, ashamed. And now I'm so proud to be it, but I don't know how to show that, in a way that might be accepted by my work peers or my colleagues.
So those are some of the internal conflicts that some of your clients deal with and talk to you about.
Yeah. Definitely. Mm-hmm.
Right. I think this is a good area and segment to take a break in. So I wanted to just say it's been a great first half talking with you, and we're barely touching the surface about mental health awareness, Pauline. We're at the first half of our segment. Thank you all for joining us for our second episode of Season 3. We're talking with licensed clinical social worker and owner of H.O.P.E Psychotherapy Services, LLC, Pauline Montemayor. Feel free to take a quick stretch, refill your water or tea. We'll be right back after this quick break.
Fly with no cape on, hoodie on this for Trayvon. On the load a new James Bond, I just wanna get paid for. Saving souls in the same song, struggles I see like Ray Charles. God I see, the God in me, the struggle actually made stars. Behind my eyelids a darker future, watch me create a brighter future. Manifest my vision, Martin Luther. Some thought I'd lose but I moved up. My soul so lost in confusion until I saw the illusion. Broke through it when I brought the truth in. Didn't take a second thought to do this. Low key in the Lower East, crouching from the rooftop. cops. Like how these thugs pick up hammers, suddenly they feel godlike. Till they shot right on their own street like Cam at the stoplight. I'ma put this to a stoplight. All these lies gotta stop. Like beware who you let close, enough to cut your neck though. Fake friends being buddy, dap and hug me, really F those. Jealousy, envy, I pray it don't end me. Pray for my enemies and those who pretend to be something they not while I'm here. Nothing is blocking my destiny. Be your own, be your own hero. Be your own, be your own, be your own hero. No one could be you, no one could be you. Gotta live life like no one could beat you. Be your own, be your own, be your own hero. Be your own, be your own, be your own hero. No one could be you, no one could be you. Gotta live life like no one could beat you.
Welcome back to Pilipinx in Wellness. You were just listening to the first part of Be Your Own Hero Rebirth by Mark Bayani Teodosio off of his 2021 album Be Your Own Hero Rebirth. You can help support Bayani by following him on Facebook or on Instagram at bayani.nyc. You can find his music on most streaming platforms including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, iHeart, Deezer, and Pandora. Shout out to all of our Pilipinx musicians out there laying down the tracks. Returning from our break, we've been talking with Pauline of New Jersey's H.O.P.E Psychotherapy Services, LLC. Continuing the conversation from our first half, Pauline, you identified what you consider the top 3 mental health concerns in your region within the Pilipinx community. In your opinion, what are the strategies or interventions that exist within our community and culture to address the identified mental health concerns that you mentioned?
Okay, so firstly, I consider myself to be more of an eclectic therapist, meaning that I like to pick and pull from different modalities and different interventions, because I do feel that everyone is unique and different, and some strategies and interventions may work well with one person, but may not resonate so much with the other. So some of the common ones that I typically utilize with my Filipinx clientele are cognitive behavioral therapy, which is just a lot of work about reframing negative thoughts, which can help to reduce like anxiety or depressive symptoms. Another big one is mindfulness. So just helping the clients to increase their awareness and their connection to the present moment, their connection to their current thoughts or current feelings that they're having. I do a lot of work around self-esteem, given what we talked about. So I do a lot of work with like positive affirmations, a lot of self-esteem building, working on increasing gratitude and having like daily gratitude practices as well. And this is also just to help build confidence and to help build autonomy, over a person's own life and them feeling confident, not only about themselves, but also about their life choices. Some of the other things, this is a big one, is boundaries. I do a lot of work with boundary setting, especially with family members. I've noticed a lot of times, and I can kind of relate to this on a personal level, that sometimes in Filipino families, there are sometimes kind of blurry or poor boundaries sometimes.
Totally.
So I've had to do a lot of work with just teaching what boundaries even are, teaching, how to set and maintain appropriate and healthy boundaries with other people. And I think the biggest part around that is a lot of times, clients feel guilty and they feel badly when they have to set boundaries, especially with family. So I think that's working on, reducing those feelings of guilt as well, and them to feel confident and empowered enough to set the boundaries that they need to with those that they have to do that with. Another one is some attachment theory stuff. For those that are familiar or not, there's like the core ones of like secure, anxious, and avoidant attachment. And, we all have our attachment styles, typically based on how we grew up in childhood. So for those that, resonate with that, I do some work around attachments as well.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. So you talked about cognitive behavior therapy. Let's talk about what's attachment theory. Let's unpack that.
Sure. So there's typically the main three. There's different sub-theories, I guess. But the main theory would be secure attachment, which is basically a healthy attachment style. You know, you're okay if the person's not there or not responding. You don't get, worried or afraid about anything. So the secure attachment is like the ideal attachment that people would like to have. There's also the anxious attachment style, which is basically when the connection is disrupted or disjointed in any kind of way, it can trigger an anxious response in the other person. And there's like a fear of abandonment or fear of losing the connection with the other person. And then there's avoidant. Avoidant are typically people who you can't get too close, so they'll engage, but when the relationship starts to get into more deeper or, levels of vulnerability or intimacy, they tend to back away, or they'll push the other person away or do things to kind of create barriers. So the relationship can only kind of hit a certain level before they back off.
And do you find a certain type of attachment style more like common within our community versus the other, or out of the three that you mentioned?
From what I've seen, a lot of anxious attachment and some avoidant as well, depending on their childhood experience and upbringing. Right.
Now, how do you talk people through that? Through those types of anxious or avoidant types of attachments?
So I, like to first educate them about the different attachment styles. And then from there, I like to help bring awareness, to what it is, what's happening, in their interactions or relationships that's causing their attachment system to get activated. And then also teaching them ways to cope, when they are feeling certain emotions connected to it. And I also like to dive in and look into their childhood and see where this may have formed, what happened in their relationship with their parents or in their childhood experiences or their caregivers that may have kind of started the formulation of these different attachment styles.
I want to dissect the boundaries piece, Pauline, because you mentioned that's a big one within our community. Sometimes even, placing boundaries seems like such a Western concept. And you mentioned also a lot of guilt in your clientele. So before we dive into guilt, how do you teach boundaries within our community to our clientele? Where do you begin?
Obviously, first is just explaining what boundaries even are. And right. I always say to clients that boundaries are healthy and they are necessary in every relationship, not just family, but even with friends, romantic partners, colleagues. They are necessary. And the point of boundaries, because I think a lot of times people hear boundaries and they think it's something negative.
Right.
Or that it's going to be damaging to the relationship.
Totally.
But what I teach is that boundaries actually help to protect the relationship and to protect the person. Because without boundaries, lines are getting crossed, and that can often breed anger, resentment, conflict. So now the relationship is more at risk of being, damaged or strained without the boundaries. So I try to teach it in a way for them to see that these are actually healthy strategies and that it's healthy to have boundaries with people. Otherwise, lines can constantly get crossed. And then now the person may end up feeling upset or frustrated or not wanting to continue this relationship with certain individuals. So.
But even talking through that process, I can imagine maybe some of your clients might feel that they're being disrespectful when they implement these boundaries, because then it kind of borders, right, that line of, am I respecting my elders? What I've been taught is to constantly respect them and not question. Mm-hmm. And so how do you even get them to start implementing boundaries, do they rehearse it with you in their sessions or in your
Yeah,
sessions?
sometimes, we'll talk about like what the boundaries look like, because boundaries can be through action or it can be even or through words, right? So sometimes we'll walk through, okay, what does this boundary look like, or what could you say? And sometimes, we'll talk through what they could say to communicate the boundary to the person. I think going to what you're saying too, I like to unpack the part about like, it's not necessarily disrespectful. And I think that comes with our culture of feeling like, oh, if you're not doing what your parents are asking or telling you to do, or your relatives, that's disrespectful, and I think there's this huge association with disrespect and, non-compliance or talking back or, and that's not the case, so one of the first things I always say to people is like, just because you're doing something that's different, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Because I think that's a very common perception that a lot of Filipinos have is like, oh, if I'm doing something different than my parents want or what my relatives want, like I'm wrong for wanting this or choosing this or being this. And it's not.
Right. Or even asking, or maybe like even asking, being asked to attend like a birthday party or a holiday party, but yet you might have an obligation to do something with a friend, or maybe you have time built in to like practice self-care, but then it's difficult, right? Having to prioritize yourself or your own needs than to like again give of yourself to attend that holiday party or birthday party where you might be surrounded by family members that you don't necessarily get along with or agree with. Are these types of scenarios that you see similarly in your clientele?
Yeah, I think it boils down to that whole guilt, and feeling obligated to honor family commitments and events. But I'm like, okay, family is important, but like your life is important too, and I think it's about finding the balance. A lot of times when I teach boundary stuff, I always say to clients that, it's really about what works for you. Because I think going back to the people pleasing thing, a lot of times people are thinking about how is this person going to feel if I do this? How are they going to react to my boundary? But the focus isn't where it should be, which is on the self. So I always, when people are trying to figure out what boundaries to set, I always say like, okay, what feels good to you? What feels right? What feels healthy for you? That's what the boundary should be. And it's less about the other person's feelings and more about you. So I think that, it kind of ties into the whole people pleasing aspect as well.
That could also be such an internal culture clash, right? For I guess first generation or American born like Filipinos or Filipinx people, where when they prioritize themselves, it's seen as individualization, right? Where when our parents may have grown up, or our relatives or grandparents may have grown up in the Philippines, it's not about yourself. It's about the group. And it's about like the community that you live in, and it's about the extended family. So that must be really hard sometimes to like really find a balance between the two.
Yeah, it definitely can be. It is. I think it's because it is that cultural clash, like I think you mentioned, and that's where I think a lot of the feelings of the guilt and the shame and stuff come up, because the perspectives are so different. But I think, I always say nothing has to be to the extremes. I think it's just about finding the working balance, like where you can still do stuff for yourself, but also still honor your family commitments and obligations as well.
Totally. Of all the therapeutic modalities that you practice, are there certain ones that resonate with our community the most?
I would say it depends on the client. For some, I think, like the cognitive behavioral therapy strategies work well. The mindfulness works well. Boundaries, I think that goes across the board. I think all people kind of, connect with that one. And another one that I actually forgot to mention earlier was also about the positive self-talk. I think that that's an important one that people can utilize, to overcome especially their anxiety. But yeah, I think it varies depending on the person and their personality and experience as well.
Are there certain books out there that you would recommend or authors that you recommend people that they could read about any of the modalities that you're talking about?
I do. There is a book called Attached. That one actually explains attachment theory. And I love that book because it's actually not super clinical. It's really written, although it was written by people in the mental health field, they designed it in a way that anyone could read the book. You don't have to be in the mental health industry to understand the terminology and everything like that. So that is really a great book to read just to kind of understand basic attachment theory. And it's cool because you can take a quiz in there to see like what kind of attachment style you have or what attachment style your partner has. And it gives you different strategies to learn how to work through some of the feelings or experiences you have that are connected to your attachment style.
Nice. And medication, is that something that you integrate also within your therapy? Like, do you bring in medication with your clients, and what are their views towards it?
So most of my clients already see outside like psychiatrists or APN, like psych APNs, for those who are on medication. It's actually a mixed bag with the views on medication. I have some who really prefer not to take medication and would just rather do the talk therapy or find more holistic methods to address their challenges and their issues. And then I do have some that take medication regularly and have found it to be very helpful and stabilizing for them. So I think it really varies per person and what their experience is. But, if there are clients that I see are having a lot more severe symptoms and I think that they could maybe benefit from at least exploring the possibility of medication, I do recommend that they see a psychiatrist that could better assess them and evaluate.
Great. Let's talk about your private practice, Pauline. Can you remind our listeners and viewers, where is your private practice space?
Sure. So it is located in Montclair, which is in northern New Jersey.
And then do you take insurance, and are you accepting new clients that are looking?
So I do accept insurance. I do take Horizon, Blue Cross Blue Shield, or any other Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. Unfortunately, I am not accepting any new clients at this time because I am fully booked. I wish I could take on more clientele, but unfortunately, all my slots are full. So I have a waiting list, but I'm not able to accept anyone at this time.
Okay, and is your therapy both in person and teletherapy?
Yes, I do offer both in person and telehealth sessions.
And since your clientele is already fully booked, if you were to refer out, or if, for our listeners and viewers that are listening in from other regions globally, do you have a way to recommend that they could find a therapist, within a certain network or within a certain region?
Sure. So first place to start is if you have insurance, you can always check through your insurance provider to see the list of providers that are in your network. The second one is a website that I always recommend to people. It's psychologytoday.com. What I love about this website is that you're able to filter your criteria. So you're able to put in any specific qualities or attributes that you're looking for in your therapist, and then they'll filter the therapist based on what you put in your search. So you can even find, therapists that are Filipino or have familiarity with our culture or the Asian American culture. So that's always a great site that I recommend for people to utilize when they're searching for a therapist.
Great, thank you.
Right.
Before we close, we always like to ask our guests, what are your own wellness practices? So we know that you have a full list of clients that you see. And so how do you balance yourself when you're not in private practice? What do you do for self-care that might be inspirational for other individuals, Pauline?
Okay, so I've had to develop some really solid self-care practices over the years, because, this work is challenging and it can take its toll sometimes. So one of my main ones is I go to therapy myself. I've been in therapy for years now, and it's been extremely helpful for me. So that's something that I go to every week. My second one is fitness and exercise. I love to work out. I love doing different workouts. And this might be really surprising to some people, but I'm actually a boxer. Boxing is like a huge passion of mine, and I actually fight and compete on the amateur level of boxing.
Oh.
Yeah, a lot of people think boxing is violent, but I mean, it can be. But it really helps to build mental fortitude, and it helps a lot for me to build, self-esteem and confidence, empowerment, especially as a woman. So that's one of my main outlets is actually boxing. I train very regularly throughout the week. On the flip side, I am also a very spiritual person. So I do practice meditation regularly. I journal regularly. I love to read self-help books, just like anyone else would read or pick up in Barnes & Noble or any bookstore. I find those to be really helpful. I also recently got certified as a Reiki 2 practitioner. So I do a lot of Reiki. Yeah, I do a lot of Reiki on myself. But this is a service that I'm hoping to roll out to my clients in the near future. And being in nature is really healing for me. So I love to, go for a walk or hikes in the park, go to the beach when it's warm here, hit the Jersey Shore, not like MTV style. That's not really my vibe. But I do like going to the beach and spending time in nature. And, I try to do a lot of things that are very grounding and very centering for me, because I need that, in order to be able to continue to sustain and do this work.
Being a boxer, are there any boxers that you follow that inspire you, that have, throughout this journey? That's kind of cool.
Thanks. I am a diehard Pacquiao fan, of course.
Yeah.
My dad was a huge Pacquiao fan, and so I, kind of grew up watching a lot of him. So yeah, that's to me that he's the greatest. I don't care what anyone says, but I'm a huge Pacquiao fan. But there definitely are some current boxers that are really great. There's some great female boxers out there right now that I also follow, like Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano. Like there's some good fighters there too. But yeah, Pacquiao is definitely number one.
That's so cool. And what about in regards to meditation? Are there certain apps or certain styles? Because that could be really broad as well, right? Mm-hmm.
There's different ones. I actually have a spiritual mentor that I study with, so I've learned different meditation techniques through her. A lot of the ones I utilize are trying to really connect with my own inner power, and also connecting more with the spiritual world. I use an app called Insight Timer, which basically has, different bells and stuff. And you can pick different background sounds, and if you wanted to utilize that. I like to sometimes meditate in silence. But guided meditations are also really helpful too. I know they have Calm and Headspace are also very common apps that people utilize for that also.
Cool. As we begin to close, how can our listeners find you if they have additional questions?
Sure. So you can contact me via my website, which is hopepsychotherapynj.com. There's an option there for you to email me if you wanted to reach out. And also on Instagram, it's The Voice for Change, and 4 being the actual number 4. So The Voice number 4 Change.
Right. Thank you, Pauline, for talking to our community about mental health awareness. We're so honored to have featured you on our podcast for our community to learn more about mental health from an East Coast perspective. We're excited to witness how your journey continues to unfold and are here to support you as your Filipinx in Wellness family moving forward.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. And to our listeners, look out for our next episode in June. We will be taking a turn and be we will actually be exploring cycling as it relates to wellness with our guest, Jordan Laksamana, based in Vancouver, Canada, our first Canadian on the podcast, and Nelson Raboy of Long Beach, California. This episode will air during our Wellness Wednesdays on June 14. As we close, we'd like to say thank you again to our guest speaker, Pauline Montemayor, our social media strategist, Kathleen Torrio, our graphic designer and beat maker for our opening and closing track, Ritchie, Mark Bayani Teodosio for our consent to use your track, Be Your Own Hero REBIRTH, that you heard partially during our break. Our advisors, Alison De La Cruz, Rian De Los Reyes, and Safo Teologo. Our community partners is Filipino American Life, SoCal Filipinos, and Trek Table, and all of our community members for your shares and support. As always, we'll share more about our guest speakers' offerings on our Instagram stories and highlights for permanent access with any of their upcoming events. Be sure to follow us at Pilipinx in Wellness on Instagram, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, and on Twitter at Pilipinx, the letter N, well, followed by the letters N and S. Don't forget to continue to hit the subscribe button on our Pilipinx in Wellness YouTube channel. Thank you always for believing in us. Be well, everyone. Continue to take care of yourselves and each other. Daghang salamat.
Maraming salamat.
Thank you.